All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Today we are going to be, is it weird to you all? It's like almost the end of the semester. Like we only have like 3 more weeks. It feels like I only just met all of you. And maybe I should say it's been a very nice class and I've enjoyed it. But with that, today we will get into kind of surveillance. So today we're just kind of going to do an introduction to surveillance, and then next class we will get more into the nitty-gritty about how surveillance and mapping works and geography and kind of how these things are entangled with each other. So today, I'll just introduce you just to the very concept of what surveillance is and how it works. It's a little more ubiquitous today with digital technology and everything else, right? And there's a lot of discussion about why surveillance, about kind of maybe the problems with surveillance as well as some of the benefits. It's kind of a mixed bag. Then we'll talk about some of the particular components of surveillance, not necessarily comprehensively, but these are components that most surveillance kind of has as part of it. We'll talk about who surveils. And in particular, we'll get into governments, but also kind of corporations and employers and everything and how they both do surveillance. It's not only governments. And we'll just briefly end with just a history of surveillance, a super brief history of surveillance, but it should be pretty cool. Before we kind of get going, does anyone have any logistical questions, anything about quizzes or labs or activities? Just as a reminder, there is a quiz that's due tonight at midnight. So if you haven't done that, don't forget. But yeah, any other questions or anything that you all have? Final project questions, anything like that? Okay, quiet class today, but I guess given the weather outside, I can't blame you. So what is surveillance? Let's just kind of start from the beginning. So does any of you have kind of we'll get into it, and if you have the slides downloaded, do not spoil it. Do any of you have kind of a rough idea or a rough definition of surveillance that you would use, kind of if you were to describe it to someone, say like a friend, a family member, just even the very concept of what it means to surveil? What would you say if you were to define surveillance, whether based on the readings or not based on the readings, just on what you know? Yeah, Eliza. Sure. So that's a good way of putting it, right? Some unknown group that kind of some unknown group that's in power that kind of monitors people that don't have power or watches them. Sure. What other definitions would you all give, or how would you describe what surveillance is? Surveillance comes up a lot these days, especially on the news. I'm sure you maybe talked about it in other classes, although maybe not. What else? How else would you kind of describe this? Yeah, Luke. Sure. So monitoring the public to make sure that nothing bad will happen is one way of putting it. Yeah, Ray. Oh yeah. So now you're thinking deeper, right? About these digital footprints that people have. So it's not just watching people with CCTV cameras or watching them from a car or whatever, right? There's these other things that are happening that aren't visual. Okay, maybe does anyone else have anything they want to add to this? I think that you've all kind of comprehensively gotten a lot of these different elements of surveillance that we'll talk about. So basically, if we want to put it this way, we can define surveillance as gathering information on individuals, groups, and activities through a variety of practical and technological means. We'll kind of problematize that a bit and add some more to it that you've all kind of already suggested. But roughly, that's what surveillance is. It's a way of gathering information. Who you're gathering information on is kind of dependent on the context. So surveillance has a really, really long and deep history. It's become very common to discuss today, given the prevalence of CCTV cameras, computers, cell phones, GPS, smartwatches. all these other things. But like what surveillance actually looks like is really dependent on the context. So we can define surveillance as information gathering, but there's going to be a lot of particularities to that based upon time and based upon place, based upon maybe who is doing the surveilling or what resources they have. So let me pose this all to you. All right, surveillance, and we'll kind of talk about this a bit more. A lot of the news media and news coverage of surveillance positions it as something that's inherently harmful, right? Something that's inherently violating civil liberties, violating the right to privacy, all these other things. But would you all say that that is totally true? Like, is surveillance something that's always harmful? So Julianne, I see you shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head no? Uh-huh. So for you, it's more about how the surveillance is actually being used and to what ends, and that's kind of what defines it. So then it could be harmful or it could not be harmful potentially. Okay, that's interesting. What else? Does anyone else have any strong opinions on this? Yeah. Yeah, sure. So kind of maintaining security, maybe in a place that has a lot of people in it, right? Like music festivals are a very, very surveilled place. I don't know if any of you have been to music festivals, right? There's security everywhere, all these other types of things. So I think that's a good way of putting it as well, right? Which is surveillance can actually potentially be harmful, potentially not. I mean, what you're both kind of getting at, right, is it's a mixed bag. Whether surveillance is harmful or not, it can be, right? I mean, it can be in a lot of situations, which we'll kind of get into some of those later, and which I have a tendency to focus on how it's harmful. But sometimes it's not though. These types of things are being brought up, right? It depends on how it's being used. Potentially, there are situations where it's actually better. If you and maybe a little teaser for next class, COVID-19 is a great example of surveillance and how it actually can be helpful. Contact tracing apps and contact tracing itself is a form of surveillance. But we'll get into that. So you're probably all getting tired of this, but I always like to kind of think about a lot of the etymology of these words. And so the word surveillance is French. It's got its origins in France, probably it's hundreds of years old. And it's a combination of the prefix sur, which means from above, and veilleur or veilleur. I don't speak French, so don't roast me about my pronunciation if you do, which means to observe or to watch. And so what we can say with this is that surveillance literally means to be watched from above. And that is often why, and I think that's what you're all getting to, surveillance, the person doing the surveilling is always in a position of power over the person being surveilled. So it first came into the English language during the late 1700s, during the French Revolution, where they had these things called surveillance committees, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that was kind of when it started really, really making its way into English through newspapers, through newspaper coverage of the French Revolution and all these other things. Surveillance actually, and a lot of people don't know this, has an opposite to it. Surveillance. So there's surveillance and there's surveillance. And what surveillance means is to watch from below. And you didn't do any reading on this. Also, actually, on that subject, before next class, please read the luxury surveillance article. We will definitely talk about it. But surveillance is just as common as surveillance, and actually not really known very well. But it does mean to watch from below. And so let me ask you this. This doesn't have anything to do with your readings, but can you think of any examples that you know of, whether in your daily life, whether in the news or anything else, that kind of would be an example of watching from below? We can easily talk about watching from above, right? I mean, I've mentioned the CCTV cameras a bunch of times. There's literally cameras above watching us all in this room right now. But What about surveillance? What are some examples of this that you can think of? And they're pretty common today. Surveillance is a lot more common now than it used to be. I'll just give you a second to think about this, but what's an example you can think of watching from below? So people who don't have power watching people that do have power. Yeah, you know. Sure. So citizens watching political figures and their actions, that's definitely a big one. There's all these watchdog groups, right, that do that exactly. So that's one example. What other examples can you all think of people who don't have power watching people that do have power? Police body cameras is that's a tricky one. That's a super tricky one, but you're definitely getting close to what I was thinking. So on the one hand, you're kind of right in that the police body cameras are watching police or people that have power over other people that's legitimized by the state. But on the other hand, it's also often erased in all these other things. So that's a tricky one for sure. So that's kind of a mix of both of them. Yeah, Eliza. Yes. Yes. No, exactly. That I wasn't fishing. I was a little bit fishing for that particular answer in response to Hayden, but that's a really, really good example. You know, all these police videos that people take on the street, and not just police, right, but just generally, are a really good example of surveillance. They're literally people that don't have power videotaping people that do have power to show what they're doing, to the point that it's actually been made illegal in some cities to do that. And so you can actually be arrested in some places for doing this. That's pretty recent. But I think you guys got it. So I just want you to, while we talk about surveillance, just kind of keep in mind that there's this other valence as well, kind of from below. So we can kind of break surveillance into about 6 different components. Not all of these are going to be applicable in every context. If you've learned anything from this class, nothing is universally applicable, or very rarely is anything universally applicable, especially when it comes to social and political problems. But the one thing that is universal to surveillance is information gathering. So surveillance at its heart and at its core is meant to gather information about people, about groups, about the activities that they do, about anything else. It's supposed to give us, or give whoever is doing the surveilling, more insight into those things. And if you all know this saying, right, knowledge is power, that's kind of at the heart of this. Thinking about the ways that knowledge of what people are doing and information about them will kind of benefit whoever's in power. It kind of allow them to make certain decisions that they wouldn't otherwise. But then we've got this. This is not universal, but it's definitely more common today than it ever was before, which is the constant possibility of being watched. That doesn't mean we're always being watched, like some people think. It means that we could always potentially be being watched. So we never actually know whether or not we are being watched. We'll get into this in a second with this thing called the panopticon. Mundanity. This is a big one. Have any of you seen The Wire? It's an older show. Charlie, you've seen The Wire? Huh? What do they do in The Wire when they're surveilling people? Uh-huh. There's a lot of bugs. There's a lot of sitting around doing nothing, just waiting for people. This is a big part of surveillance. It would be really cool to teach a class just on that entire show. But yeah, like this, actually, The Wire, and if you haven't watched it, you should. It's so good. The Wire is a great example of how boring surveillance is. You know, I know a lot of people think it's like surveillance is the cops watching across the street, right? Watching someone or whatever. That's not really how it is at all. They might be watching people, but a lot of times it's people, and not only cops, literally sitting around and doing nothing and waiting for something to happen, you know? And so surveillance oftentimes is really mundane. And because of how mundane it is, that actually makes it more powerful because people aren't looking for it. They're not thinking about it. So that's kind of this third component. that one is not universally applicable. You know, in some contexts, you do know you're being watched very explicitly, and that's kind of part of the fear. Then we've got security and risk management. So I think this is what both Luke and Connor were kind of getting into. Surveillance is often meant to produce a sense of safety and produce a sense of security while also minimizing risk. And so to do that, what they're doing is they're watching people as much as possible under the idea that the more people are being watched, the more safe they are, the less likely anything bad is to happen or anything that's harmful. Whether that's true or not is more complex. We've got data analysis. That's a pretty big one. And so this is why this is in this class, essentially, is, you know, data collected from surveillance, it has to be analyzed, and that you have to find patterns in that data. It's not enough to actually have the data. You also have to interpret that data that's being collected. And we got visibility or findability, if we want to talk about GPS and stuff. Surveillance is, at its heart, meant to make people easier to find. It's meant to make them more visible, more legible, we could say. And so that is why smartphones are such a useful tool for surveillance, is because they have all this information about you. You can be tracked pretty much all the time through them. I don't want to sound, you know, too much like a pessimist or anything, but that is kind of what's happening in a lot of ways. And you're more visible yourself when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to smartphones, I should say, for surveillance. So then we've got this thing called the panopticon. Have any of you heard of the panopticon, or do you know of the panopticon? So how would you describe the panopticon, or what is the panopticon? I saw a few head shakes. Yeah, Maddie. Mm-hmm. Did you say you've been in one, or the one you know of? Oh, where did you go to one? Oh, interesting. Okay. I want to talk to you more about that, actually. But since we're all right here, it's okay. But yes, exactly. So the panopticon is an early architectural blueprint for early modern prisons. It was first developed in like the 1790s, just about 1780s, 1790s. So the thing with prisons prior to now is that they worked a lot differently in the past. They were a lot less formal. There were a lot less prisoners, and also the prison itself was not a form of punishment. The prison itself was actually just where people waited to be punished, but it actually was not even considered a form of punishment itself until around this time when the panopticon kind of came out. So like, you know, at that time, right, prison officials were often looking for new ways to surveil prisoners. And so it would make it, basically they wanted to make their own lives a lot easier so that way they could manage prisoners easier, you know? So there's a very famous geographer who was an anarchist named Peter Kropotkin, and he has a very good memoir that's also very long. And he went to prison multiple times throughout his career, throughout his life. And he has this description of being in prison in France where he talks about how his wife would actually lived within the prison grounds, and they would go on walks around the prison grounds. And like, that's not anything like how we understand prisons today, you know? That was a little bit later on than this time, but it's really to say that early modern prisons are not what they are now. And so Jeremy Bentham, philosopher, founder of this utilitarianism philosophy, was the person who designed the panopticon. And so what the panopticon was a blueprint for a new kind of prison. Its goals were essentially to make it so that way everyone was always possibly being watched through the architecture. And Maddie, I think you put it really well in describing that, right? Where there's this area right in the middle, and then it can see every single cell within the prison, but the prisoners never actually know whether or not they're being watched. And so the theory for this is that if you never know you're being watched, you will change your behavior just in case you are. So that way you don't even have to be violently or physically disciplined, you just discipline yourself. And so we can actually see that here, right? So the guard would be kind of right around here where my cursor is. And then the light would be shining into each cell. And that's a way of kind of both making the people in the cell more visible, but also blinding them from being able to see whether or not they're actually being watched. These are typically like two-way mirrors, so no one actually knew, kind of regardless. This is so interesting to hear, Maddie, you saying that you actually went to a panopticon kind of structure, because at the time that this was created, it was almost immediately forgotten, and there weren't any panopticons built at the time. Or there were, if there were, it was very few. It's surprising to hear that there's one that has this design in Ohio, but not that surprising. So for a while, people didn't even think about the panopticon, right? Basically, Jeremy Bentham came up with it, and then he just kind of didn't do much else with it, and nobody really built it. Also, not that much later, he founded one of the first modern police forces. He was kind of one of the co-founders, which a lot of people don't know. And then we get to the 1960s and 1970s with Michel Foucault, who we've kind of discussed in passing a few times. He was a philosopher. He studied disciplinary behavior and punishment and government and all these other things. He's very, very, very prodigious, however you say that word. And he actually was the person that revived the panopticon in our modern kind of parlance. So he basically used it to describe how people, the surveillance society that we live in. And so what he was trying to say, right, was not that actually panopticons are everywhere, but that we literally live in a panopticon where we're constantly being watched, but we don't actually know if we're being watched. And he was doing this in like the 60s and 70s. So like, I mean, he would be amazed at what's possible today in this way. And so basically, when we talk about surveillance, the panopticon is kind of one of those key metaphors for surveillance. It will always come up when you talk about surveillance. And it's essentially a key, like a metaphor, right, for thinking about it, even if there are some places where the panopticon actually existed. And so now, you know, this is kind of the most common way of thinking about surveillance and studying surveillance. It's referenced in a bunch of disciplines: geography, sociology, history, computer science ones talk about the panopticon. You know, there's a lot kind of going on here. Is this all making sense to everyone? I don't want to go too quick. Surveillance, panopticon. Does panopticon kind of track for you all? Okay. And so there's now in the modern world, there's a lot of different ways that we can be surveilled, and like so many that I can't even possibly name all of them. That would be like an entire class or an entire course in and of itself, just to talk about that. But we've got a few. So we've got things like drones are a pretty new one. Monitoring phone calls is one. CCTV cameras are one that we often think about, and we'll actually talk about that here in a few minutes. Drones are a pretty common mode of surveillance now, especially because they're so small and they're so quiet and they're so advanced in ways that they weren't even like 5 years ago. Remote sensing, so stuff we've talked about in this class, is often used for spying or surveillance. And we actually even talked about some of this, right? During the Cold War, that's what a lot of remote sensing technology was developed for. GPS, we'll get more into that both of those next class. Monitoring your internet history, so kind of like what Ray was saying earlier, where we have these digital footprints where we can, what we buy, what we view, what we do on the internet essentially can be tracked in a lot of different ways. Purchase history, kind of along with that. Voice assistants on your phones. That's a really pretty common one. So for a long time, actually, this is kind of an important one. So for a long time, the kind of dominant narrative within surveillance studies was that you could not, it's not that your phone was actually listening to you, it's that the algorithms were so good that it appeared as if your phone was listening to you, right? Like you'd be talking to a friend and suddenly an advertisement would pop up for something, you know? And for a long time that was true till the past 5 years. And now we've got all these voice assistants, these home, you know, these things like Alexa or Siri or the Google Home Assistant or whatever, right? That people actually put into their homes. And so now both the algorithms are really good and they're literally listening to you in ways that was not possible before. And kind of along with that, we've got if this will even work. Kind of along with that, we've got some other stuff as well. Smart doorbells and smart cameras, pretty common. How many of you have a smart doorbell or a smart camera or something like that? Yeah, definitely a lot. So a lot of those cameras, and I don't know if you know this, a lot of those cameras, especially with Amazon, they sell that footage to police departments and stuff that's being taken, often without your consent or anything. So just something to keep in mind, although we live in a smart world, so it's kind of hard to avoid a lot of these things. Okay, so do you all kind of, the concept of surveillance, how surveillance works, these types of things, does that kind of track to everyone? Or do any of you have any questions or anything about that? Okay.
I think too, like one of the important connections here is how prisons are used as testing grounds for surveillance technologies.
Oh, yeah, true. So can all of you hear on this side of the room? Could you hear what Joe was saying? So what Joe was just saying, thank you for bringing that up, is that another way of thinking about surveillance when it comes to prisons is that a lot of the technologies used in prisons are actually kind of like blueprints for how it can be used outside of the prison. And so if you think about ankle monitors function pretty much the same as this watch that I'm wearing. And so a lot of those are tested and developed within the context of the prison before they proliferate outside of the prison. Thank you for bringing that up. That's important. That's an important thing I should have mentioned. And so now we kind of come to this question, right? Which is, you all know roughly what surveillance is and how surveillance works, what the methods are, but who exactly is doing the surveillance, or who is surveilling? So there's a couple of answers to this. The first one that people usually think of, and I think fair enough to think of government, is governments. Governments are often some of the biggest surveillers. And so, why do they surveil? Governments surveil for a lot of reasons. The first is to kind of that point we were talking about, to increase security and minimize risk. The state or governments want to maintain a sort of social order that kind of allows them to continue. If there's no order or no social order, it makes it really difficult for governments. And so they want to kind of avoid that at all costs. And so to do so, they want to kind of make it appear as if there is kind of the utmost security and safety and minimize risk, and have these risks kind of minimized, whether it's actually true or not. They want to collect information. And so kind of along with that, they want to collect information on political dissidents, enemies of the government, these types of things, as a way to kind of increase that security and minimize the risks that are being done. And they want to control populations. It makes it a lot easier to control populations if they think that they're always constantly being watched in some ways. And so this is really, really common, especially in the US, but not just the US does this. It happens in a bunch of places. One of the reasons that governments surveil as well, or why they're so big into it, is because governments just have more money, and governments don't typically have to make a profit. And so they have a lot more resources to be able to surveil, using taxes, using kind of a variety of other ways that they receive their money. Debt often is a way that they do this. And so because they have those resources and because they have that money, it means that they can surveil at a rate and to an extent that is far greater than a lot of corporations are able to do. So in the US in particular, which is kind of my area of specialty, so I can't speak to a lot of other places about how they do this and how governments there work. But in the US, it's pretty massive, the amount of surveillance that people are under on a daily basis. But the extent to which it's known is not really known. So we know that it's a lot. We know that's really massive, but we don't actually know exactly what's happening because a lot of that stuff is kept private. So there have been some surveillance programs that have been revealed. So like COINTELPRO for a long time was one that kind of happened. The NSA stuff with Edward Snowden about 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, maybe, is a really, really kind of big one, where he leaked a lot of documents that the US government was surveilling everyone, regardless of their affiliations, their phone calls without warrants, kind of all these other things. But this is certainly not the extent of surveillance. You know, these are just two known programs, two known ones, right? I mean, how many others are there that we don't even know about at all? Probably a lot, but this is kind of what makes studying surveillance tricky, which is we can never actually know exactly unless there's some leak in government documents or anything like that. So with that, I'm going to, well, we can watch this video real quick, and then I'm going to break you into groups for just a quick exercise, kind of on a website. Oops.
Data is being collected about people all the time in various forms. Surveillance technology isn't really invisible. It's something that you can see very easily if you know what to look for.
Okay, I'm going to go back.
Data is being collected about people all the time in various forms. Surveillance technology isn't really invisible. It's something that you can see very easily if you know what to look for. So right now we are standing outside of the office building that houses the domain awareness system. The domain awareness system pulls in feeds from surveillance cameras, both police-owned and some private. It pulls data from automated license plate readers, traffic sensors and sources into a single processing and analysis center.
Real quick, this is important. One of the things about surveillance as well to keep in mind is that when you're collecting information, you're often collecting information from a bunch of different sources and then putting that data together as a way to interpret it and find patterns and everything. So a lot of times data that has a geographical pattern in it or doesn't have a geographical pattern in it innately is kind of combined with data that then can show the geographic patterns.
Run by the NYPD, developed in collaboration with Microsoft, launched in 2012. A single surveillance camera may not be that useful, but having surveillance cameras all over the place that can track the movements of somebody throughout a city can be very useful. Those are some automated license plate readers. There's also a pair of them on the back of that NYPD vehicle over there. So what they're actually doing is photographing and basically, identifying license plates. These aren't like targeted against a specific person. These take a photograph of every single vehicle, so completely innocent drivers are stored in a database somewhere. Shot spotters are basically acoustic sensors that are designed to detect gunfire. If 3 or more devices register a sound event simultaneously, that audio recording will be sent to a processing center. A technician will listen to the audio and determine whether or not it's a gunshot, and then if it is a gunshot, dispatch that information to a police department. Shot spotters are supposed to address the fact that despite gunfire being a problem in lots of cities, not many people always call 911 when they hear a gunshot, for a lot of reasons. There have been 2 incidents in which audio of people's voices were caught in a recording and used actually in court cases against people in shooting incidents. So we are pretty sure that up there on top of that building is a shot spotter. I'm hesitant to definitively call anything. I definitely found it without somebody actually corroborating that, but that's the closest thing I've seen. One of the things that's definitely in public space in a lot of cities in America, but a lot harder to see and point at, are stingrays. Cell phones are basically constantly seeking out towers that belong to their carriers. What a stingray will do is basically imitate a cell tower, which will then send metadata about that particular phone to that device. The primary thing they do is indicate that a particular phone was in a particular location at a particular time. They can also intercept calls. They can obviously kind of by extension collect metadata about those calls. Knowing if there's a stingray around is really hard. In New York, particularly if you see those kind of big mobile command units, if there's anywhere that you would be reviewing intercepted material from a stingray, that seems like the most likely spot. Being able to identify surveillance technologies in public space doesn't magically make them go away, or it doesn't make them stop doing what they're doing. It is kind of worth paying attention to, if nothing else for the fact that it is kind of designed to be ignored. But being able to understand the specifics of what kinds of technologies are being used, by whom and against whom, is important for being able to effectively challenge their uses.
What do you all think of that? Any just like first thoughts on this video? Just like right off the dome? It's pretty scary. One person saying this is scary. Any other thoughts about this or anything else? Yeah, Luca. It does feel kind of like this dystopian thing is video game or movie for sure. And there are ways of kind of resisting this and everything, but it is very, very common. Anything else other than that seems dystopian, kind of scary? Anything that surprises you about this, or you maybe didn't understand or were kind of confused by? Okay. Oh yeah, Eliza. Uh-huh. I would guess so, yeah. So it's kind of unclear what they do with a lot of that data, but I mean, if they're finding, if they have these things kind of in the same spots all the time and they're seeing people going with the same license plate in different areas, I don't see why they couldn't do that as well. I don't know what the NYPD is doing in particular. I know that there are stingrays like this in Bloomington and there are stingrays like this in Indianapolis, for sure. Although I don't know how common they are in comparison, as far as surveillance goes. Anything else that you all are kind of thinking about this? Or anything that was kind of surprising? The stingray thing is pretty wild. That for me is the most surprising. ShotSpotter is kind of freaky too, but like stingrays are really concerning. The ways that they actually make your phone think they're a cell tower. So now I'm going to give you all a few minutes. So let me pull this up real quick, just that way you all can see it. But we're going to go over a form of government surveillance that is not like that. One that is actually far more kind of mundane. So you're going to go to this CDC. The link should be on Canvas as well. The CDC, the kind of location tool. And then you're going to put in Monroe County and then click submit. And then what I want you to do is I want you to go through, and there's the questions on the board, so you'll be able to see it, but go through all of this stuff and see what data is available just about Monroe County. And so you can do this with your groups. And here's what questions you'll be answering. So after you've kind of spent a couple minutes going through this and seeing what's available, talk about what you found surprising as far as the information that's available is. And maybe even it's something you're kind of confused about how they were able to get that. And then talk about which of the 6 components of surveillance that we were talking about that you see that are present within this tool. And then talk about whether you think that this form of surveillance, because this is from the CDC, this isn't from the Department of Defense, this isn't from the FBI, this is from the Center for Disease Control. Talk about whether you think, what about the benefits or the disadvantages kind of doing this, and whether those harms kind of outweigh the advantages that they entail. And so with that, I am going to make your computers available, if that will work. Okay, cool. So you should be good. So I'll give you about, I don't know, like maybe 8 or 9 minutes to do this, just kind of with your groups, go through these. Are all your computers working? For those of you that are using the computers at your table? Is this one working? Yours isn't working? Okay. If you can't get it working, you can just use your computer, it's fine. The links and everything are on Canvas, and I'll give you 2 minutes, and then Joe and I will start walking around. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, huh. I had never noticed that before. What else did you all find surprising about the data that was even available? When you were looking at this CDC, what data that they had, were you kind of surprised that they had that data? And why is this why do I frame this as a form of surveillance? What are kind of the reasons for that? Maybe if we want to move on to that next part. What are the 6 components? What components do you see in this tool? So we can give you one, right, which is information gathering. So besides information gathering, what are kind of some of these other components that are present here that you see? Yeah, Connor.
I guess visibility is like here's the people like that have asthma.
Yeah, so it's creating invisibility, both in terms of, well, I guess not literal visibility, you know, it's not visualized or anything, but it is showing visibility in the sense that it's telling us who has asthma. The asthma thing, pretty surprising as well that they have that data. A lot of questions about how they got it and whether people actually even consented to that data being shared in the first place. So let me ask you this, just thinking about this as a type of surveillance, would you say that this kind of outweighs some of the risks of surveillance? I mean, because in some ways, right, we can even see issues with privacy here in terms of asthma and stuff, but it's not necessarily individual privacy. And so like, what do you all think of that? Does this outweigh the risks? Any strong opinions about this as a form of surveillance, about whether it's more harmful or less harmful? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. So you would say then that it does outweigh the risks in this particular context, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would also agree with that. For those of you that didn't hear what Carter was saying that he views the risks here as kind of minimal, or at least they're kind of offset by the fact that you can't really identify individual people based on this data. And there's a utility to knowing a lot of these things, right? So like with the particulate air matter, there's kind of a utility to knowing if people are actually have asthma as a result, these types of things. So I would agree with that. Does anyone have any strong opinions otherwise or kind of against this? Okay. So I don't see anything, but we'll kind of continue. And you were going to have another activity, but I went too long on this one. So just kind of we'll go back to it a little bit. But the other people that surveil are workplaces. So it's not just governments that surveil, although it's very easy to say that it's just the government. But the fact of the matter is a lot of different groups surveil people. And surveillance when in the workplace and surveillors are actually corporations are probably the biggest surveillors, like maybe bigger than even governments, at least on a global scale. It's super common. How many of you have worked a job when you were in high school or in college or whatever? Aiden, where'd you work? Out of what place? Did they have like security cameras or anything? Yeah. Who else? Luke, where did you work? Where? At Culver's. What kind of surveillance did you see when you were in Culver's? Okay, so surveillance cameras kind of for cash registers and stuff. Sungju? Is that? I'm sorry, what's your name? Yeah. Kara, I'm so sorry, Kara. I knew it. Where did you work? Where? At a bank? Oh, so that's a lot of surveillance then everywhere for sure. And have any of you worked like an office type job at all? Yeah, Julianne, what did you do? Wait, you had to take personality tests to work there? And what job was this? What job was this? Oh, weird. That's a new type of surveillance for jobs that I have never heard of. Joe, have you heard of this? I did not know that there were jobs that you had to do personality tests on, but that's like pretty wild though, that they're literally surveilling you so deeply that they want to know your exact personality characteristics as well. That's a new one. It does kind of make sense, though. I'm actually surprised that's not sooner. But the point of all this, right, is all of you pointed out that every workplace you've been at has had some type of surveillance associated with it. I did the same thing when I was in high school and college. I worked at a Barnes and Noble, constant surveillance to the point that one time I had my phone out while I was at the register, and a manager came and talked to me about how I shouldn't have my phone out when they weren't anywhere near. So like and it didn't matter anyway because I didn't care about that job, but you know, this is just everywhere. I'd be kind of hard pressed to think of a job these days that doesn't have some type of surveillance associated with it. So employers surveil for a bunch of reasons. They want to gain information for profit. That's probably the one that we're most familiar with, right? Google, Amazon, all these companies do a lot of surveillance because they can collect data that then they can profit from, which we've talked about before. They can make their algorithms a lot more precise and accurate because they're using your data as sort of this test data. And the more data they have, the more accurate it'll be, the more precise, the creepier. They'll surveil workers to increase productivity, which was my example of getting caught with my phone when I was at Barnes and Noble, right? They thought I wasn't being productive because I was on my phone, and they were kind of right. I wasn't being productive. It's a Barnes and Noble. Who cares? Reduce theft. So whether reducing theft by employees or reducing theft by customers is a big one. And to counteract labor organizing. That's actually a really, really pretty recent. That's not recent, it's actually old, but it's come back into the news more recently, which is a big reason that people surveil is because they don't want unions, or employers surveil is because they don't want unions to form, and they don't want a union to form because they know that will kind of get in the way of their profit margins. And so what surveillance acts as in this case is kind of a form of intimidation to intimidate people from signing union cards, all this other stuff. And you know, you can talk to Joe or I about this, but even IU did this. Even IU has done this when we were trying to unionize as graduate students at IU. To the point that, so I don't know what's happening in the media school, but in our department, we never send any emails even related to the union on IU servers or through our IU emails. It's all through personal emails because it became clear that they were watching and following and listening to whatever emails we were sending, you know, and as a form of intimidation to say, we know you want we know you want a union, and therefore don't have it. We're going to be watching you constantly and threatening you. So this is a big part of workplace surveillance, you know, and that's one example, but Amazon did this as well. So I'll play like 30 seconds of this clip.
Faced repeated backlash from its workforce over alleged unsafe conditions within their fulfillment centers and the company's mistreatment of its employees. The world's largest retailer has been accused of suppressing the voices of its workers. Many employees have repeatedly made efforts to take collective action against the company for better working conditions. But rather than listening to their employees, an article recently published by Vice claims the company is actually ramping up surveillance on its workers. Amazon recently put up 2 job postings for intelligence analysts to track labor organizing threats within the company. Lorenzo Franceschi-Biccarai is a senior staff writer at Vice's Motherboard and author of that article. He joins us now. Welcome, Lorenzo. Thanks for being with us. So what exactly are these jobs listings, and explain why they are so controversial?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me.
Because of the time, I'm not going to finish the video, but keep an eye on this. This is an extreme example, right? They were literally hiring people from the CIA and the FBI to spy on people who were labor organizing and trying to organize for a union. But they're not the only ones. IU, I don't think, went that far, but definitely other companies have in the past. Okay, so I was going to have you do this exercise. Some of you, I think, were kind of already exploring it a bit, but maybe when you have a minute, just check out this link right here where it's got all the CCTV cameras, or at least at the time that this was published, kind of in the world, you know, and it's showing what cities are the most surveilled. Like, I'll click on it real quick just so you can see. But it's kind of showing where all of these cities are being surveilled and which ones have the most surveillance. And what you'll notice is that if this will work, there we go. I'm going to zoom out a little more. Let's see, I might have to actually just zoom out. There we go. So what you'll notice, right, is that a lot of the surveillance is actually not in the US, although there's some spots for sure. A lot of it is in China, a lot of it is in India, a lot of it's in Europe. But like you notice, right, even on this top 10, the US doesn't even appear once as far as surveillance goes, you know? And so while my own focus is on the US is not the only one doing this stuff. So we'll continue, and now we'll talk about a very brief history of surveillance in 9 minutes. So my mistake for going a bit too long. So surveillance has always existed. It's basically existed as long as societies have existed. You know, there's always been some need, whether from growing countries, growing cities, growing nation states, whatever, for information about the people that they govern. And so to do that, you know, they've had to surveil their populations kind of in a variety of ways. And so surveillance is not new. Surveillance is very old, and surveillance even appears in stuff like the Bible. So it's very, very old, you know, and a lot of these ancient texts. So there's a lot of these examples that we can find historically. These are just like a few of them. So in ancient Egypt, surveillance was really, really common. If anything, this actually might be kind of one of the founding areas of surveillance. And so Pharaoh Ramses, I think the fourth, I can't exactly remember. And, you know, Egypt kind of was invaded by this group called the Hittites. I don't think there's that much known about them and what their kind of deal was. But Pharaoh Ramses needed surveillance against the Hittites. And so what they did was they gathered a lot of surveillance about them from areas that had been invaded, or gathered a lot of information using surveillance about that. And as a result, what they were able to do, the Pharaoh Ramses, you know, they were actually able to defeat the Hittites who had been invading Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh using a lot of this information. We've got Rome is a big one. Julius Caesar was literally a spy master before he was a Caesar, or I guess before he was king. He was a spy master, and he had a bunch of spies, and he actually had a lot of spies within the Senate, you know, and so a lot of people, you know, think he would just stab just because they hated him. Part of it was because he was surveilling everyone in the Senate constantly. French Revolution was a big one. This is where surveillance came into English. So Maximilien Robespierre put together these things called surveillance committees. Every city had one. They were composed of about 12 people. And what surveillance committees would do would be basically to watch people, recruit people to watch people, you know, all this type of stuff. So that way they could figure out who to guillotine in some cases, or just like figure out who to punish. Religion and surveillance. I hope you all like this picture on top. Literally watching from above. I just think it's like an amazing picture. So I can't speak to this too much, but one thing I can say is that a lot of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have their basis kind of in surveillance. I mean, if we think about it, right, a lot of these religions are predicated on the idea that there's some dude watching you all the time at every moment. And if you make a mistake, you're going, you know, to hell or wherever else. So we can think of this as the God's eye view, literally, watching people from nowhere, constantly surveilling them. This is the panopticon in action prior to the panopticon, where the panopticon, I mean, basically, you can't ever actually know if you're being watched if you have these beliefs and everything. What about Santa? Ever thought about Santa and how Santa, yeah. The elf on the shelf is so creepy. I almost brought that up as well, but even Santa himself is doing surveillance. So, you know, he might not have all these cameras, right? But he's always watching you to make sure you're not, to check if you're being naughty or being nice. I'm just thinking about this in relation to the upcoming, you know, winter break and everything. So in some way, we can even think of Santa as actually getting children used to being watched. That might be a little like pessimistic or cynical of me, but I mean, if you're constantly as a child thinking you're being watched, it makes you think about it a lot less when you're older. We've got these things called lantern laws. I wish I could spend more time discussing this, but roughly in the 1700s to 1800s, there were these laws that were passed in New York City especially, but not only, where basically what they were doing was mandating that anyone who wasn't white, so especially Black people, whether they're free or enslaved, had to always carry always be accompanied by a white person at night, or always be carrying a lit lantern. And so if we want to think about those 6 components, this is literally making yourself visible at night. And so this is a kind of an early form of surveillance. And this is actually happening before police departments even existed. So this is certainly an older kind of phenomenon. And I wish that we had more time to discuss it. I'm sorry we don't, because this really deserves a lot more kind of conversation about the influence of lantern laws historically, and kind of even the ways that we can see lantern laws in place today. They might not be called that, but they definitely have these kind of afterlives. Yeah. Oh, true. The Karen figure. So think about the Karen figure in popular culture, right? Those memes and everything. That could even be a way of thinking about this, you know. So then we've got COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was the counterintelligence program run by the FBI. I went from 1956 to question mark, because we don't actually know whether or not COINTELPRO is still happening. We know it was happening in 1956, and we know it was going to the 1970s at least, but we don't actually have that much other information about it. And so what the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover in particular, who we could see as a kind of a foundational figure in modern surveillance, especially in the US, were doing was targeting political enemies, civil rights activists, foreign people, people who were affiliated with the Communist Party, kind of all of these other people, you know? And so there are a lot of these targets of the COINTELPRO. Actually, there's a Wikipedia page that just has literally a list of everyone that was surveilled by COINTELPRO that we know. So Martin Luther King Jr. was kind of targeted, and maybe just a slight content warning for what I'm about to tell you. The FBI actually tried to blackmail him using their surveillance into committing suicide by using an affair he had against his wife, using an affair he had and saying, "We're going to send this to your wife," which they did. And so that all kind of came out, but he didn't end up doing it, you know. Muhammad Ali, for his anti-war stances, was surveilled a lot. Angela Davis, if any of you don't know Angela Davis, she's amazing. You know, she was surveilled for her work with the Communist Party and the Black Panther Party. James Baldwin, the writer, for a lot of his work. Jane Fonda, the actress, who still is getting arrested for a lot of stuff. So she really has never given up, and a lot more. Then we've got the Stasi. All you need to know about Stasi: East Germany's intelligence service during the Cold War. East Germany was the most surveilled country that we know of per capita. They had 90,000 full-time employees, part of the Stasi, 170,000 full-time collaborators and informants, and like hundreds of thousands of more people who are part-time employees and informants. And so what that means is that 1 out of every 63 people work for Stasi, surveilling other people. And this guy right here, Putin, that's where he got his start prior to getting into politics, was doing a lot of this stuff. And so what this led to was really, really high levels of distrust. And that distrust in part came from the fact that, actually, I'm going to show you guys a picture real quick, and then we can kind of call it good. But part of that distrust came from the fact that you didn't know if you were ever being watched or not. And now check this out real quick. This is a picture of Ronald Reagan when he was in, let me make it bigger real quick. This is a picture of Ronald Reagan when he was in Moscow during his presidency. Do you all see a familiar figure here? Perhaps on the very left side. This is before anyone knew who Vladimir Putin was. This is literally a picture of him spying on Ronald Reagan when he was here. So with that, I'm sorry for having to cut this lecture a little short because I went too long, which is a good lecture. Next class, surveillance and geography. Please read the luxury surveillance article, and don't forget about quiz 3 that's due tonight. It's hard not to go too long.